What's up, guys? As you can see, this is not going to be a typical guitar review. One of the biggest things I've run into over the years when dealing with ultra low budget guitars is that you tend to make some sacrifices in terms of quality control. It's just to be expected when you're dealing with very, very inexpensive guitars. But that leaves you wondering exactly what kind of problems might you encounter with a guitar. And a typical review that only shows one guitar isn't necessarily going to be able to give you that kind of information. So if you think you might be interested in this type of a guitar, but you're not sure about what you might run into if you buy one, this is the video for you. So let's go. Welcome back, guys. If you're new to this channel, I hope you'll consider subscribing, maybe liking this video, and even leaving a comment below to let me know what you think. What I'm trying to do is give a whole different perspective on guitar reviews, guitar repairs, and guitar upgrades. And all of those are going to have a focus on budget. And it doesn't really get much more budget than this IYV PRS style semi-hollow body. These are typically available for around the $150 mark, which is really as cheap as you can get when it comes to a semi-hollow body carved top type of a guitar. Whenever you're dealing with something this inexpensive, ultimately the reality is that one of the things you're going to be missing is quality control. But it's not always really obvious what sort of issues you might have with a guitar like this, because most people only have one to review. And so you can maybe see what issues theirs had, but it doesn't really give you a good idea of what you may expect when you buy one. Now, honestly, 4 is still a small sample size, but it's a lot bigger than 1. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go through these one at a time, and I'm going to look at 4 main categories. The first category is going to be cosmetics. I'm going to examine each one of these and try and make a determination whether each one of these maybe has some unique cosmetic problems, or if I see cosmetic problems that are consistent throughout. The next thing I'm going to look at is the nut, because this is really one of the most critical components on a guitar, and it really translates into playability as well as how well it intonates and just how well it tunes to pitch or not. So I'm going to look and see on each one of these whether they tune the pitch smoothly, and I want to look at the height on the first fret just to see if the nut slots are cut to the right height. The next thing I'm going to look at is the quality of the fretwork as well as the quality of the fretboard itself. The frets are one of the most critical components to having a great playing, great feeling guitar. You want nice smooth frets so that you can have nice smooth bends. You want nice fretwork so that your hand can glide up and down the neck nice and smoothly. And you want consistent fret height so you can have nice low action. The fretboard itself, we're going to look at the quality of the inlays, the routing for the inlays, as well as how well it's rolled and just how the overall fretboard feels. The next thing we're going to look at is the setup quality. I'm going to measure the action height, I'm going to measure the neck relief, and I'm going to check the intonation. Again, that has a big impact not only on how the guitar plays, but how it sounds. How consistent is it from one guitar to the next? And then the last thing I'm going to look at is the overall construction quality. How well put together does the guitar seem? Once we establish our action and determine whether it's consistent, we can look at our bridge height, and that'll help us see if these all have the same neck angle or if there's a lot of variability on that. Because that's another area I've seen on budget guitars, and even some expensive ones, where you have inconsistent neck angles, and that can sometimes prevent you from getting the action where you want it, especially if that neck angle is too shallow. And then lastly, I'm also going to check and make sure that all of the electronics work the way they're supposed to. And I'm going to check the resistance and the inductance of the pickups. Since these are machine wound pickups, I expect that we're going to see quite a bit of consistency, but if we do see some variation, that can be kind of telling that maybe the pot values aren't real consistent from one to the next. And again, that's an area I've seen with inexpensive guitars. Because they use the cheaper pots, there tends to be a much wider spread in the pot values than with something that uses a higher quality alpha or CTS pot. So we're going to take a look at that. What I'm going to do is use this spreadsheet that I put together, and I've got all my categories on the side here, and I've got all 4 of my guitars, and I've got some area for notes. So now I'm going to go do my detailed analysis on all 4 of these, and I'll be back to share what I learned. Well, I'm back. I went through all 4 guitars, and I went through each one of those areas that I had mentioned before, and overall I think my results were in some ways surprising, in some ways definitely not surprising. Let's start with the cosmetic quality. This is an area where, to me, it's pretty obvious is where they saved their money and cut their corners. Every one of these guitars has numerous cosmetic defects. Not just 1, not just 2, but numerous. They're all over it. On one guitar, it looks like the binding was scraped by a blind guy. It was really, really poor. On a couple of guitars, like number 3 right here, there's a little bit of damage right along the edge that I think needs repair. There are some pretty significant indentations right underneath the pickup on guitar number 4. Those were the 2 worst issues. Aside from those, all of them had some areas where they weren't sanded and buffed properly, so they're dull, or you can see where they sanded out a blemish in the paint and they either didn't do it fully or they sanded it but then didn't fully polish the area, so there's still a blemish there. I don't think any of these are deal breakers, but I do think that's something that you need to expect at a guitar of this price. The other observation with regard to cosmetic quality is that all of these have the F-holes finished very poorly. This is not binding, this is paint, and the paint is applied right to the rough routed surface inside of the F-hole. And a lot of these have some of the black paint that was applied to the inside, either in that binding area or right on the surface outside of the F-holes. Again, these are minor, but they're things that I think are worth noting. Now next I'll move to the nut quality. This is another area where I think you should temper your expectations. These are bone nuts, which that's great. However, the nuts really look like the slots were cut with a chainsaw on most of these. They're not really evenly cut. Some of them look like they're very V-shaped instead of being a nice narrow cut. And you can tell that the overall shape of the nut is pretty rough. Care was not taken to really finish the nuts. I also discovered that on every one of these guitars, the nut slots are still too high. And it varies from guitar to guitar. On some, it was about 9 thousandths. When I would fret at the 3rd fret, I measured this gap right here on the 1st fret. And it varied from about 9 thousandths up to about 13 thousandths. That's not horrible, but it's high. But I don't really see that as a bad thing overall, because there's still enough material left on the nut that you can fix this nut if you know how to do that, or if you want to send it to a luthier. You don't need it replaced. You just need this nut fixed. So it's not terrible, but definitely not what I would consider a high point on the guitars. So another thing worth pointing out are the tuners. On all of the guitars, I could consistently feel that the tuners were kind of gritty, not real smooth. Some were tough to turn, others weren't. I think that's another thing you just need to accept with a guitar at this price point. They're completely and totally functional. They're going to keep it in tune. Tuning up, it's got enough resolution that you can get there. They work good. They just don't feel premium. The castings themselves are a little bit rough, so they don't have that nice high polished chrome like you would get from better tuners, but again, fully functional. Now moving on to the fret and fretboard quality. This is an area where I guess I'm not unhappy with what I see based on this price point. Now, for one, the fret ends are not protruding. There's no fret sprout on any of these guitars. The frets are filed back, and the overall fret height is really pretty consistent. I had a couple of high frets here and there, And on one guitar, it got pretty bad above the 15th fret. But overall, not bad. And they're all good enough that with a reasonable action height of around 4/64ths, you're not going to have any fret buzz or any issues. They're all going to play fine with the frets the way they are. Now, in terms of drawbacks, even though the frets are filed and there's no sprout, you can see the tooling marks on the frets, and they're still sharp. Not sharp like they're going to cut you, but we're not talking about like the hot dog ends that you see on a Firefly guitar or the well-dressed fret ends that you would expect from a higher-end guitar. They're very crude, but again, they're quite usable. The one complaint that I really have about these frets is that they are extremely gritty. Let me see if you can hear this. Hopefully you heard that. They're so gritty that when I first started playing on one of the guitars, I actually had the string slide underneath my finger when I did a bend because there was so much resistance when I did that bend, the strings just went right under my finger. It was difficult to play. It was difficult to do vibrato. It was very difficult to do bends. As I played the frets in a little bit, that went away and it started to feel better. But my recommendation, if you were to get a guitar like this, if you're not capable of filing the fret ends, that's okay. Like I said, you can live with these, but absolutely, absolutely sand and polish these frets. That's going to make a huge difference in terms of playability on these guitars. Out of the box, the frets are just way, way too gritty. Now, in terms of the fretboard itself, these were all very consistently dry, but the fretboards do feel smooth. I think they can benefit certainly from some oil, but also from a light sanding, just to help refine that smoothness a little bit more and just make it feel more like a quality rosewood or maybe even an ebony. That's something I would recommend. The edges of the fretboard are not rolled. I can't say that they're sharp, but they're definitely not rolled. That's another area where I think you can play it just fine like it is, but if you prefer that feel of a rolled fretboard, that's something you may want to consider doing. The inlay, I think, is well done. It's clear that it was all done by CNC, definitely not by hand. Along the straight areas and along the larger sections, it's nice and clean. You don't see a lot of filler around it. However, on the smaller sections, like at the tip of some of these flowers, you do see a lot of filler just because the bit that they used is a lot larger than the end of some of those pieces. And rather than use a smaller bit and have it take more time, they use the larger bit, overcut on those pieces, and then just filled in the fretboard. Again, to even get an inlay on a guitar this inexpensive, to me, is pretty impressive. I don't necessarily care for how it looks, but there is a lot more time involved in doing that than going with normal block inlays. So overall, I'm pretty impressed with that. And across all of the guitars, the frets and the fretboards were pretty consistent. So I think you can have a high confidence that if you buy one of these, you're going to have the same experience. So now we get into the setup quality. And this is an area where I was legitimately shocked. I couldn't believe how consistently set up these four guitars were. I've gotten a lot of cheap guitars, and over the years, the only thing that was consistent is that they all had terrible setups. They all had high action, they all had a ton of relief in the neck, and none of them were ever intonated. That's not the case at all here. In terms of action height, the lowest action I came across on any string across these four guitars was just a hair under 4/64ths of an inch. The highest action I came across on any of these guitars was just about 4.5/64ths. So pretty much everything you see was set up consistently with a 4/64ths action height. And I'm really impressed by that. It's not something I see very often, and I think a 4/64ths action height is a great, comfortable, playable action that anybody can use. And to have all of these guitars come with that action really impressed me. Now, the action doesn't mean a whole lot if you have really inconsistent neck relief. Ideally, you want a pretty straight neck. You want your relief to be somewhere in the 7 to 10, maybe 7 to 12 thousandths range. Typically, when I get these inexpensive guitars, the truss rod is never even tightened, and so they always have too much relief. On these, I had a couple of guitars at about 12 thousandths of relief. I had one at 10 and I had one at 9, which is all on the higher side of completely acceptable. In my mind, there's no need to tweak the truss rod unless yours happens to be outside of that range, maybe because you're in an area with a more extreme climate. But for all 4 of these to come with a proper amount of neck relief really impressed me. Lastly is intonation. That's another area. I never get guitars like this that are intonated. Now, granted, intonation on a guitar like this is a lot different than something with 6 individual saddles. It's less labor intensive for the most part, so I would expect a little bit more consistency. But what I saw here was almost perfect all across, and even the B and the G strings, where they have this separate adjustable section to do those 2 strings, everything was done really well. The most variation I saw was plus or minus 5 cents on the intonation at the 12th fret. And again, for a real low budget guitar, I don't think you could really ask for more. Very few people are going to be able to hear that 5-cent difference. So overall, setups on these really impressed me. Another thing worth mentioning is the bridge. This bridge with the intonatable B and G string section looks just like the one that comes on the Harley Benton version of these guitars, which is a Wilkinson branded piece, and generally the Wilkinson stuff is very good. When I was examining these guitars, I pulled one off, I checked it. This one is definitely not a Wilkinson. It's very lightweight, and the casting on the underside looks pretty cheap. But on the top here, the chrome looks really good. It's well finished, and it seems to intonate really well. So although it's not really a high quality piece, I don't feel like it's holding the guitar back in any way, and I really don't see a need to change it. So now that brings us to the construction quality. Now obviously on a fully assembled, fully painted guitar, there's not a whole lot that you can see. But what I was able to see is that the overall construction is not necessarily like you would get from like an ES-335, where it's a laminated back, laminated top, and then a center block. This appears to be a single solid piece of wood that was then routed out to leave a piece of wood right here for the neck. It's routed here, and then there's another block that's left right around this area, and then this whole area is routed out of that solid piece of wood. The top, I assume, is a laminate of some sort based on some of the markings I can see on the F-holes. But looking inside, everything looks like it's pretty consistently done. It's not super smooth or super clean in there, but it's well enough routed for the inside of a guitar. Now, in terms of the other area that I really wanted to check, I wanted to check the neck angle. That's another area that I see a lot of variability on with these set neck guitars, and not just on cheap guitars. It's even an issue on a lot of expensive set neck guitars. So, with the action being consistently at 4/64 across all 4 guitars, I did notice a little bit of variability in where the bridge height is. But with every one of these, there was still enough adjustment left that you could bring the action right down until it was touching the strings. There were a couple of guitars that had about 1/8 of an inch of adjustability down remaining, and the other 2 guitars had about 1/4 of an inch of adjustability. So that's a really good sign too. One other thing I noticed with these bridges is that if you look at the angle of the screw, it's not perfectly straight up and down with respect to the body of the guitar. They're all canted forward just a little bit. Now, I can't say for sure if that's string pressure that pulled them forward, or if it's just the angle that these were initially drilled at. They may have been drilled with respect to the neck angle and not necessarily the body angle. I'm not real sure. But one thing I did notice is that this wood inside does seem to be a pretty soft wood, so I'm not sure over the long haul whether you're going to see these potentially move or not. But with such a soft wood, it is a possibility. Now we can get into the electronics, and this is another area that I thought things were pretty consistent, but I can't necessarily say I'm surprised by that. I wouldn't expect a whole lot of variability on the pickups themselves. They're machine wound, they should be pretty consistent. I think where some of my value differences come from are from the tolerances on the potentiometers. These are dime-sized pots, and specifically the volume pot, if there's a little bit of variability in that, it is going to impact my measured resistance values. But looking at these pickups, I was a little bit surprised to see that this is a really low wind in the neck, which explains why it had more of a bright sound to me. And these all measured right around 7K. The highest was at 7.06 and the lowest was at 6.97K. So very consistent across that. And they were all pretty similar in their inductance too. I measured between 3.15 Henry and 3.24 Henrys. So that shows that it's a pretty low inductance, which is why you have a brighter sounding pickup. Moving to the bridge, this bridge was a whole lot hotter than I expected, and I did notice more variability here. On the low end, I had one pickup that measured at 12.9K, and it measured at about 6.5 Henrys. On the other end, I had a pickup measure 13.4K and a little over 7 Henrys. So that's going to be a lot more like maybe a JB or a Gibson 498R type of pickup. Definitely going to have a little bit more sauce on it than I would normally expect from a semi-hollow. Overall, the only other real thing I could say about the electronics is that the output switch is your typical boxy style cheap switch, and it feels it. And the output jack I had no issues with, but I know from prior experience that these low-end output jacks can sometimes not last too long. So one other really interesting thing that I noticed when I was going through these four guitars was the serial numbers. Now, 3 of these 4 guitars have the exact same serial number, and this one here happens to be 1 digit higher. So I don't know exactly what purpose those serial numbers serve. Apparently none. I don't know that it matters, but I just thought it was really interesting that they don't seem to actually serialize these. And lastly, I did decide to weigh these guitars, and I was somewhat impressed that the overall weight was pretty consistent, although there's not a lot of wood in the body, so I guess that's not really a surprise. Overall, these are very lightweight. They all come in right around the 5-pound mark. The lightest one was 4.77 pounds. The heaviest one was 5.17 pounds. So in all 4 cases, really consistently right around 5 pounds. So that's how these compare. I think that should give you a really good expectation for what you can get for $150 odd if you decide to buy one of these guitars. You're going to have some cosmetic issues. You're probably going to get a relatively poorly cut nut. You're going to get scratchy frets. But that's really the extent of the drawbacks. Beyond that, it's a great, plain, well set up guitar once you take care of those scratchy frets. And I'm really, really impressed with just how consistently well set up these guitars were. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out, it's not necessarily a comparison, but I did want to point out that these do have a very thick neck profile. I would say that this is at least as thick as the Pattern Vintage PRS neck, probably more like a 57 or 58 Gibson type of neck profile. It's a very thick neck. Personally, I love having a guitar with a thick neck. I don't like thin necks, but if you're looking for something with a thin neck, this is definitely not your guitar. So anyway, I'm not going to bore you with any playing. There are already plenty of videos out there with guys playing these guitars where you can get some sound samples. My focus here was really to show you what kind of variability there is from guitar to guitar. I hope you found that valuable. If you did, let me know in the comments below. And also, if you'd like to see something like this again, I would really like to have that sort of a feedback. What I would love to be able to do is get enough folks together in advance to be able to purchase a large quantity of guitars like this, and then what I can do is do the review just like this one, and then take care of some of those potential issues that these guitars have before I ship them out to the folks that bought them. If that's something you're interested in, please let me know in the comments also. Now, with regard to these guitars, what I'm going to do is pick my favorite, which happens to be number 3, even though it has the worst piece of damage. But I'm going to pick number 3. I'm going to keep that. I may do some additional videos along with potentially some upgrades to it. The other 3 guitars, I'm going to take care of the remaining playability issues by fixing the nut. I'm definitely going to improve the frets and fretboard, and I'm going to take care of some of those minor cosmetic issues, and then I'm going to list these for sale. So if you may be interested in one of these guitars because you want to try out the guitar, but maybe you don't want to deal with some of the work that they need, then check my links below. I'll have the links to these listed on my Facebook Marketplace, and you can contact me through that if you're interested in one of these. So anyway, I really hope this helped. I hope you found it interesting, and I would love to hear from you guys in the comments about potentially doing more videos just like this. So until then, guys, thanks a lot.